Greetings, Hex and counterplayers, and welcome to my presentation of Wargame Design Studio's latest Panzer campaign's release, Donbas 43, and in particular the essay that comes along with the Donbas 43 package, The Operational Art of 1943. This essay discusses why depth beats frontage, a Donbas case study in echelon warfare, mobile reserves and the mid-war turn. So I think this will be of interest to all Panzer campaigns players. In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front did not merely shift from German initiative to Soviet initiative, it changed the terms of what could work operationally. German commanders still understood manoeuvre, still knew how to counterattack, and still fought with a professionalism that could turn local situations in their favour. Soviet commanders still made mistakes, still bled heavily, and still occasionally drove their spearheads too far ahead of their supporting infantry. But across the second half of the year, an operational logic increasingly favoured the side that could create and sustain depth. Depth in defence, depth in offensive echelons, depth in reserves, and depth in time through consecutive operations that denied the enemy a real pause. That is the real meaning of the operational art of 1943. It is not a single brilliant manoeuvre, nor a mystical doctrinal revelation. It is the emergence of a campaign rhythm in which tactical cracks can be turned into operational dislocation quickly enough that the defender cannot restore coherence before the next blow falls. It is the point at which holding the front becomes less a matter of bravery and more a matter of systemic capacity to absorb shock, redeploy reserves, keep headquarters functioning, keep artillery and engineers supplied, keep movement routes open, and keep the next operation ready before the current one ends. The Donbas campaigns of 1943 are a particularly clear lens through which to see this change because the region is both defensible and dangerous. In the assault phase, rivers, minefields and prepared positions make defence appear decisive. In the exploitation phase, roads, rail lines and industrial towns make retreat risky because movement becomes the battlefield. If a defender cannot reseal a rupture quickly, the fight stops being about positions and becomes about routes, time and cohesion. This essay is a conceptual explainer anchored by a case study. A narrative is present, but it is not the point. The aim is to show why a frontage-heavy posture became increasingly brittle under 1943 conditions, why a depth-oriented method increasingly succeeded, how the Donbas fits into the broader evolution of mid-war operational practice, and what lessons the case illustrates, especially in terms of Soviet echelon structure and German attempts to fight a mobile defence with a shrinking pool of mobile reserves. One caveat matters for tone and accuracy. When this piece contrasts frontage and depth, it is not claiming Germany simply chose the wrong doctrine out of ignorance. By 1943, frontage was often a condition imposed by force-to-space mismatch, manpower strain, and political constraints. Likewise, Soviet depth was not a magic switch. It was a capability being rebuilt unevenly and applied more consistently as resources, training and experience accumulated. 1943 is a hinge year where the mechanisms work more often without being the fully mature systems you see later. Frontage and depth are often treated as simple opposites. Frontage is linear defence, depth is layered defence. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. In 1943, frontage and depth are better understood as competing operational systems, ways of distributing combat power, decisions and time. Frontage defence, at its best, is not stupid. A continuous line can be a strength, especially when it anchors on strong terrain, when it is dense enough to prevent easy penetrations, and when it is supported by reserves capable of counter-attacking decisively. The classical German defensive ideal on the Eastern Front did not imagine the line as a static wall. It imagined a forward zone that held with economy, strong points, mutually supporting positions, mines and anti-tank guns, while the real decision came from counterattack. The attacker would be channelled, slowed and disorganised. Then mobile forces would strike at the moment the attacker was most vulnerable, ideally cutting a penetration at its base. That method assumes prerequisites. It requires sufficient infantry density for the forward zone to slow the attacker across a wide area. It requires enough artillery and anti-tank infrastructure that concentration brings punishment and the attacker's timetable slips. It requires operational reserves that can move, arrive and strike quickly enough that the window after the breach has not already shut. And it requires the freedom to yield ground early enough before withdrawal becomes a scramble that sheds equipment and cohesion. Depth is different. It is not only more trenches, it is the distribution of combat power that allows the system to absorb shocks without making every local crisis an existential one. Defensive depth means layered resistance, planned fallbacks, and reserves positioned so that a penetration does not automatically become a collapse. Offensive depth means echelons that pass through each other. One echelon to breach the tactical zone, another to widen and deepen, mobile forces to exploit, and additional forces to secure the corridor and sustain momentum. Depth is therefore not only spatial, but organisational and temporal. It is the ability to keep choices after the enemy has hit you, and the ability to keep pressure after you have hit the enemy. The practical differences become obvious in 1943, when Germans can concentrate reserves and counterattack early. Their frontage system can still reset the front. When they cannot, the same system can delay but struggles to repair. When the Soviets can combine deliberate breach with follow-on echelons and corridor protection, penetrations become ruptures. When they cannot, the same offensive energy produces a salient that invites the classic German pinch at the base. Section 3. Why the Donbas makes the theory visible. Donbas offers clarity because its geography makes operational mechanics obvious. In the assault phase, the defenders' advantages are tangible. The Mayas in the south and the Seversky Donets in the north are serious obstacles when defended by experienced troops behind mines, wire and pre-registered artillery. The steppe is not empty. It is a space where approach routes can be exposed, where high ground and ravines can channel movement, and where the attacker can be forced into predictable corridors that artillery can punish. A prepared defence can impose costs and time and create the illusion of permanence. But once a rupture forms, the Donbas becomes the opposite kind of environment. It is a region of towns, railways and road junctions that tie the defence together. Industrial nodes matter because they are movement nodes. Rail lines matter because they govern supply and redeployment. Roads matter because they determine whether reserves can arrive in time and whether withdrawal can be controlled. If a defender cannot move laterally, cannot shift reserves, cannot evacuate heavy equipment, cannot keep supply lines functioning, then the front becomes a series of isolated local fights rather than a coordinated defence. That matters because it shapes what success looks like. In a purely positional fight, success can be measured in kilometres and strong points. In a rupture and pursuit fight, success is often measured in the defender's loss of coherence, a line that cannot be resealed, a reserve that arrives too late, a core boundary that becomes a gap, a road network that becomes a traffic jam of retreating columns, a headquarters displaced and out of contact. The attacker's advantage comes not only from the strength of the breakthrough, but from the speed with which that breakthrough becomes a system problem for the defender. There is also a political economic dimension that shapes tempo. The Donbas was industrially important and symbolically significant. That encouraged hold a little longer decision making, and in a deep operational environment, that is often disastrous. It does not mean holding for a week and then withdrawing neatly. It often means holding until the enemy is already threatening routes of withdrawal, at which point withdrawal becomes hurried, equipment is abandoned, and cohesion erodes. Deep operations exploit decision constraints. Delayed decisions become operational vulnerabilities. 4. The German Donbas defence. Prepared lines, limited operational depth. The German defensive system in the Donbas was substantial. After earlier fighting, the Germans fortified river lines, built belts of trenches and strongpoints, laid dense minefields and anchored positions on commanding heights. The Maas line in particular gained a reputation for its strength. Yet a defensive belt can be tactically formidable, yet operationally shallow if the force behind it lacks depth. By 1943, German infantry divisions were frequently tasked with defending very wide sectors. This was not simply a preference, it was a force-to-space problem. A division stretched across too many kilometres cannot be strong everywhere. It must rely on strong points and thin linkages. It must accept gaps covered by fire rather than by bodies. It must depend on reserves to restore coherence if the enemy finds a weak seam. This is the moment where frontage stops being a choice and becomes a condition. The German defence still wanted to be elastic, still wanted to be flexible, still wanted to avoid fighting to the last metre. But elasticity has requirements. It requires permission to yield ground early enough and reserve strength to punish overextension. When the defence is thin and reserves are scarce, the forward line becomes a fragile skin. It can resist strongly in places, but it has fewer ways to recover if the attacker creates a rupture. Fortifications alone are not depth. Mines, trenches and strong points buy time. Depth is what you do with that time. If time does not produce a decisive counterstroke, or at least a controlled fallback to another prepared position, the defence becomes a delayed rather than stabilised. In the Donbas, that distinction becomes the hinge between the line holds and the line is only a speed bump. 5. The Donbas as a laboratory. Gallup in winter 1943 and what it reveals. To understand why the latter 1943 Donbas fighting trends towards depth beats frontage, it helps to look briefly at an earlier Donbas episode from the same year, Operation Gallup, late January through early March 1943. This is not the July-September Maya story. It is a winter operation. But it matters because it captures two truths in a sharp, almost schematic way. First, it shows how Soviet operational ambition could outpace the practical ability to sustain and protect mobile thrusts when corridor security, resupply and realistic assessments of enemy capabilities were not fully addressed. Secondly, it shows how dangerous the German counterstroke could still be when the Soviets overextended and when German mobile forces could be concentrated against exposed spearheads. In Gallup, the Soviet command sought a deep swing through and beyond the Donbas, aiming at operational objectives that would disrupt German withdrawals and collapse the defensive structure in southern Russia. Soviet forces advanced rapidly in places and mobile groups pushed far forward. But the further the thrusts ran, the more the familiar vulnerabilities appeared. Fuel, ammunition and food became limiting factors. Mobile units moved beyond the capacity of roads and rear services to keep up, and air resupply was not always available or sufficient. Deep thrusts that look brilliant on a map become fragile if they are not continuously fed and if the shoulders lag behind. There is also a cautionary human element here, optimism. A commander who believes the enemy is withdrawing tends to interpret movement as retreat rather than as concentration. In early 1943, Soviet headquarters sometimes misread German intent and capabilities, taking certain movements as evidence of withdrawal when in fact German mobile forces were preparing to counterattack. That optimism shaped orders and the willingness to drive mobile groups at any cost toward distant objectives. The German response in February 1943, when German panzer forces and elite formations struck back, demonstrated how a counteroffensive can turn a deep thrust into disaster if the thrust is not supported and cannot be resupplied. Overextended Soviet mobile corps found themselves attacked from multiple directions, and some formations effectively died on the vine, abandoning equipment and scattering back toward friendly lines. The lesson is not that deep thrusts are wrong. The lesson is that deep thrusts demand depth in support, corridor security, sustainment, and realistic appreciation of how quickly the enemy can concentrate a counterstroke. This winter, the Donbas laboratory is useful for your 1943 argument because it gives you a before and after within the same year. In winter, Soviet deep ambition could still collapse into vulnerability when supply and corridor problems went unsolved. By late summer, Soviet operations increasingly planned for those problems with deeper echeloning, heavier supporting fires, more systematic corridor protection, and a better ability to absorb German counterattacks without losing the entire operational initiative. 6. July 1943. A frontage system that still works, once. The July fighting in Donbas is valuable because it shows that the German defensive method still functions under the right conditions. While the German offensive at Kursk was underway, the Soviets attacked in the south to pin forces and complicate reserve movement. Assaulting a prepared belt over a river line is never cheap. The Soviet effort gained ground in places but failed to produce a decisive operational breakthrough. The Germans managed to restore the front by concentrating mobile reserves and striking back hard against exposed penetrations and bridgeheads. In simple tactical terms, July looks like a Soviet failure and a German success. Operationally, it is more revealing. It shows that the German method still works if it can concentrate a counterstroke quickly and with sufficient mass. The decisive factor is not the cleverness of the counter-attack, but whether the defender can still create the conditions that make it decisive. July also reveals the cost of doing so. Mobile reserves are not free. They are spent by movement, worn by emergency commitment, and depleted by combat. When an elite armoured formation is used to extinguish a crisis, it may save the line, but it also burns itself. Vehicles accumulate wear, spare parts vanish into maintenance queues, crew casualties erase experience, and fuel consumption grows painful. The reserve that saves a day in July may not be available or as effective when the next crisis arrives. For the Soviets, July is a harsh rehearsal. It shows that cracking a belt is not enough. The breach must be widened quickly. The shoulders must move, and the corridor must be protected against flanking counterattacks. It shows that exploitation cannot be later when convenient, because if exploitation is delayed, the defender reorganises and the breach becomes a salient, an invitation for the classic German pinch at the base. So July matters even without decisive gains. It consumes German reserves, forces redeployments, and teaches the attacker what must be solved in August. It also contributes to a broader phenomenon of 1943, the Germans being forced to repeatedly expend their mobile strength, while the Soviets increasingly plan not only for a breakthrough, but also for the immediate problem of keeping it alive. So there you go, listeners. We're now up to halfway through this extremely interesting document, and I encourage you all to get a copy of Donbas 43 to play the game, or if at very least duck off to the WDS website and grab yourself a copy. So we still have sections 7 to 12 to go, but I think at this stage it might be best if I give you a bit of a break, and I'll go forward and see if I can put the last half of this presentation together, and hopefully I can get it up in another week or so. So I hope you've enjoyed this so far. Personally, I think it's a very interesting document and something very useful, I think, if you're interested in this style of game. So hopefully I'll be back with part 2 of the operational art in 1943. Thanks for listening. Bye.